Okay, so now that we have the concept mesh done, we're going to go ahead and translate this into the final mesh that we're going to use. And mainly the way we're going to do this is use the existing mesh to create clean meshes through extraction and other various techniques. But the first thing I want to do is use some Z-spheres, and I'm going to go ahead and position them in his body so they kind of fit roughly about the size of his body, but a little bit smaller. And the reason for this is I want to make sure that we can keep the illusion that there's a ton of detail going on within the character. And we don't want to do that too much on the surface because it'll get a little bit noisy, but we need to have the underlying structure of the character. So this will be a placeholder for the undersuit or the kind of tight skinning area that will be applied to the character, and then the armor would kind of be placed on top. And then what we can do is build in between the actual armor and this kind of skinning that we're creating right here to give the illusion that there is some depth to the character and that it's not just a shell with some hard surface details. So I'm just moving the Z-spheres around, trying to scale them to about the size I think it would be for the character. He's a little bit bigger than normal, but that's okay. It needs to fit the suit also. So that's first and foremost, and then after that we can make it look as regular as possible. So I'm just using move, scale, and rotate up at the top to adjust these Z-spheres and move them around. Add the calf right here. There we go. Alright, and it's looking pretty good. Maybe a few more tweaks. So I'm going to go ahead and click A to check out my adaptive skin. And I like it, so I'm just going to go ahead and make a Polymesh 3D and tweak it from there. Your Z-spheres will never be perfect, especially when you're using an adaptive skin as opposed to a unified skin. So it's okay once you're close enough to just create the Polymesh 3D object and then append it and use the move tool or the move brush to start positioning things into a more proper position. Alright, so you can see I kind of have it pulled out to where the under armor would be. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the torso. And you can see I have a lot of layers on there. That's just from the concepting stage. But what we're going to go ahead and do is take the torso, duplicate it, and kind of just smooth it out. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the torso subtool and duplicate it. And the reason I'm duplicating it is because I don't want to destroy my original concept that I have, but I do need to modify it to be able to create the actual objects we need, the subtools we need. So I'm going to start with this under area, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to extend the polygons past what I need so the masking will be easier. Because you notice when you actually mask areas that are close to a surface change, when you extract those, it gets a little bit iffy, starts to fold in on itself. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. So I'm just going to go ahead and come in here and mask this area out. Alright, so turn off the other subtool and clean up the mask a little bit. There we are. And now we can go ahead and go down to extract. I'm going to change the thickness to 1, and I'm going to click extract. Alright, and I moved the subtool up to the torso area, so I have everything confined to the same area. And you can see we have our polygroups, so I just merged the two polygroups on the outside to make sure that they didn't have too many polygroups, because when you extract from a mesh that has multiple polygroups, it'll actually keep those polygroups, but in this case we don't want those. So I went ahead and hid the edge and just auto-grouped what was visible. Alright, so I'm going to keep turning on my concept mesh, and what I'm trying to do here is just to make sure that it fits well and that I'm not making any massive sweeping changes with the conversion to the actual mesh. Some of the changes will be intended, so I'll keep some of the changes, but a lot of them I just want to keep the general idea that we have with the concept because it has a really good flow. Alright, so I'm using the same duplicated mesh to kind of carve out this area. And what I'm trying to do here is not necessarily make the piece, but make this subtool appropriate for grabbing an extraction. So I need to move this mesh around and extend it past what I need so my masking can work properly. I'm going to go ahead and extract at -1 so it pushes into the mesh. That way I don't have to move it around. And you can see I got a lot of pinching from the mesh creation. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is just use group loops to smooth it out a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the smooth tools to just kind of average out all the polygons and give us a cleaner mesh to work with. And I want to go ahead and inflate it a bit just so I have a thicker mesh to work with. It's generally a better idea to work with a thicker mesh. That way you don't accidentally affect polygons on the other side of the mesh. So now I'm just using a combination of the move tool and the H polish brush. And I'm using the H polish brush to get that really smooth, hard surface effect. And it's important to note that the H polish brush can be used in the negative, and when using the negative, the H polish brush builds upon the surface. Alright, so I'm using the clipping brushes now to just kind of make sure that it aligns correctly with the previous object we made. And now that I have this mask, I want to go ahead and grab our next object. And you notice I'm using the new mesh that I've created to extract this new object. And it's really the thing that you want to think about most is what's going to be the easiest way to make our new mesh. There's not necessarily a rule that you have to use the concept mesh or you have to use a certain mesh. It's whatever's going to take the least amount of time and give you the result that will be easiest to work with, which is really important. So I'm going to go ahead and use my clay tubes brush to build this out a little bit and then smooth it back to get a workable mesh. And I actually didn't have my symmetry turned on, so I had to go in there and mask the side that I changed and smart resim the object. It's important to note that when you actually create a new mesh, when you extract a new mesh or create it with one of the various techniques, it won't have symmetry turned on. Symmetry affects each subtool individually. So if you have one subtool that has symmetry on, you can go to another subtool and it won't necessarily be on. Alright, so for this one I thought it would be easiest to go back to the concept mesh since we do have the overall form to go ahead and grab that new mesh. So I'm just going to go ahead and mask out all the area that I need. And again, notice how messy the mesh is. It's a good idea to clean it up, but it doesn't always have to be perfect. It's kind of a balance between speed and creating a mesh that's easy to use. Because you can always make a mesh easier to use. It might take a little bit of effort, but it'll always become workable eventually. So you can see I have an extra poly group here, so I went ahead and merged that with the exception of the edges. So I can go ahead and use my group loops. And again, just like the previous object, I'm going to go ahead and smooth it back a little bit just to make sure that it's going to be easy to work with. You can see I'm just kind of fixing the folding that the mesh is doing on itself. And now we're going to use the H polish brush again to kind of get our hands dirty. And it was kind of, when you use the H polish brush, it subtracts away from the mesh. So sometimes the mesh will get a little bit smaller than you wanted it to be, or might get smaller than the concept was. And one way to fix that is to just go ahead and use the inflate deformation tool to bring it on back. And inflate will damage the the sculpting you've done. It'll damage the hard edges that you've produced, but since you've already made them and they're somewhat there already, they're just a little bit softened, they'll be easy to get back with the H polish brush again. So to make sure everything's in position. And I'm always rotating around the mesh and checking from different angles to make sure that the surfaces are truly continuous. So from some angles you can kind of see that there's little bumps in the mesh, but from other angles it might look perfectly smooth and clean. So it's a constant. And like I did there, changing materials helps a lot. You can see with the more glossy material, it's much easier to see the imperfections in the mesh. And it's also a really good idea to just change your material every once in a while, because the way that the lights affect the materials, or affect the meshes, excuse me, will kind of change the overall look of the mesh. Okay, so now I'm going to use the clipping brushes to kind of go ahead and cut the border of this mesh. There we go, with symmetry on, that'll work just perfectly. Okay, so I want to make this underlying area. So what I want to do is I want to use the planar flatten brush to kind of bridge between those two meshes and kind of make sure that I have a pretty good estimation of where that mesh would be, where that underlying plating would be. And it doesn't have to be perfect because it's not going to be seen as much. The only areas that are going to be seen are the fringes of the mesh, like the bottom areas that have that protrusion. So an estimation is more than fine for this. So I'm using the clay tubes brush to just kind of build up the surface of the mesh, and then smoothing it back with the smooth brush. And now I'm going to go ahead and mask this area, or the area that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a border around the area that I want, and just go ahead and fill it in. There we go. Because I went ahead and extracted it, and you can see that I have multiple polygroups that I don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and hide my edges. Invert this selection here. And use the auto groups and the polygroups to kind of unify that. That way my group loops apply as successfully as I'd want them to. Otherwise I would have extra cuts in the mesh that I don't really want, and that would actually pinch the mesh when I tried to work on it. Alright, so I have this mesh, so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and smooth it out and use the H polish brush to kind of make the surface as polished as possible, as the brush implies. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of brush over this, and you can see that as I use the H polish brush, it definitely cuts away from the mesh. So what I need to do is I need to inflate it to make sure that the mesh doesn't get too thin. And I'm just going to go ahead and keep moving this around. So I'm using transpose here and rotating that in a little bit. But the move tool is perfect too. Yeah, it's really a preference on which tool you use to get these into place. And I deflated the mesh a little bit because I felt that it was getting a little bit too thick. The plating was getting a bit thick. But since it's not even, you notice some areas are actually thicker than others, I need to use the inflate brush rather than the inflate tool to go ahead and get that, make sure that all the areas are even in their thickness. Alright, so I'm just trying to, using me rotating around the model, I'm just trying to check for areas that are imperfect in the surface. And even though this area is not going to be seen, we're going to be extracting out of it, so the work I do now will save me a little bit of work later. But you could apply that work whenever. This mesh is actually pretty good for right now. But a few more H polish strokes on here, and I think we can go ahead and use the clipping brushes. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and hold the space bar to move that into position. And remember, the clipping brushes are just Control, Shift, and drag, just like the selection brushes. And now what I want to do is I want to hide part of the mesh, or not really hide it, but mask it. Because sometimes the clipping brushes can affect one side of the mesh perfectly and completely destroy the other side of the mesh just because of the camera orientation, or if you have symmetry on, it can actually provide undesirable results as well. So in order to combat that, we can just go ahead and mask half of the mesh and go ahead and use Smart Resim after we have the results we want. Alright, I'm trying to get a kind of 45-degree angle here because I thought it looked pretty cool. So I'm just rotating around the mesh, going to an area that's kind of perpendicular to the camera and cutting away at about 45 degrees. And these areas don't have to be perfect because we can go ahead and use the H polish brush to fix them later. So an approximation works just fine. And in some cases we won't even need the approximation because it looks pretty good as it is. Alright, and so now I kind of have this mesh folding over one of the other meshes or clipping through it, and I really didn't want that, so I went ahead and moved it around. Alright, so I'm just using the H polish brush to kind of clean up these areas of the mesh that we used the clipping brush on. And you notice sometimes the H polish brush can kind of flatten areas of the mesh that you didn't want to, or it'll soften areas that you didn't want. So you can go ahead and just resharpen those by making the H polish brush a little bit smaller to fix those. And I want to go ahead and make this area look like it's kind of integrated into the chest a little bit, so I went ahead and used the clipping brushes to cut away at that. Alright, so now I want to make the next piece of the mesh, and since it's directly on top of the other piece, it made the most sense to just use the previously made mesh to create our new subtool. So I went ahead and masked out the area I wanted, and went to extract. Make the thickness of 1 to keep the thickness kind of the same, in the same range. Okay, and right off the bat, you notice we have an issue. We have an extra mesh that we didn't want. And this can sometimes happen when you have a mesh that you're masking from and extracting from that isn't exactly perfect, or it might have a little bit of surface strains on it. So what we can do is we can go ahead and, you see we have polygroups here. So what we can do is we can go ahead and hide these polygroups that we don't want, and then we can just go ahead and delete them. So once I deleted the area I didn't want, I went ahead and actually just deleted the whole other side, because we can always use the mirror and weld function to mirror that back over. Or if you happen to be on the wrong side and the mirror and weld will not work because it works from positive to negative, you can go ahead and just use the subtool master and mirror from there. And I'm using the clipping brushes to get it into place. And you notice I have the concept mesh up in the top left corner as kind of a reference. Well, all I did there is dropped it to the canvas by taking the subtool and having it shown, and then moving it up there to that area and clicking Shift S, and it'll drop that subtool to the canvas, and you can continue working. All right, so now I'm creating the chest plate, and since it's directly on top of the previous mesh we made, it makes the most sense to just extract directly out of that. All right, so I'm going ahead and just cleaning up my mask a little bit. And we'll go ahead and extract it. And again, I'm moving all my subtools. I'm moving all my chest subtools to where the concept chest is, just to make things a bit more organized. All right, so now that we have that, we can go ahead and use group loops to smooth it out a little bit and make it so the mesh is a little bit easier to use. And I have polyframes on just so I can see exactly where the group loops are and how they're being affected when I smooth the mesh. Alright, so now we can go ahead and use the clipping brushes on the two previous meshes we made to clean them up and make them more like the concept. Sometimes you'll see I draw the clipping brush the wrong way, so if I clipped it, it would delete the part of the mesh that I want. And the way that I fix that is just using the spacebar and moving it to the other side. That way you're not stuck undoing things all the time. And so there we go. I'm going to go ahead and smooth this out a little bit and use the H polish brush on it to clean it up a little bit. Alright, so now we can go ahead and clip the chest plate using the same technique. Just kind of going around the fringe of the mesh and cutting away the areas that we don't need. And then I want to go ahead and relax the polygons on the mesh. Alright, so now I'm going to cut in just a little detail in the kind of angular way that I want to keep a theme with the characters. So I'm just going to go ahead and go around here and clean this up a little bit as well. There we go. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and cut angles into this the same way I did with the other mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and clip that away. Remember, clicking Alt twice gives you a hard direction change with the clip. There we go. All right, and just clip a little bit of this. Again, keeping that same kind of angle that I had with the first mesh. It worked really well, so I want to go ahead and keep that going. All right, now I want to go ahead and integrate this mesh a little bit better than it previously was. So I'm going to go ahead and go around these areas that I have already, and I'm just going to clip away the areas that would intersect into the other meshes. So go ahead and use the mirror function again to clip that away. And the main thing I want to do here is I want to make sure that everything feels like it could possibly be in terms of reality and in terms of mechanics. So I don't want a lot of very messy areas and areas that are intersecting a lot. I want to try to keep away from that, and I want to keep it looking as if these areas are connected together with physical means that we actually use, such as bolts and nuts and stuff like that. And that the proportions aren't too crazy. And so now I'm making just a little bit of a mesh in here. And this mesh is mainly going to function as a visual way to connect the chess piece, which is actually floating above the mesh in front of it, or below it, I should say, and the mesh below. So we can go ahead and just push that out using extract. And it gives us a nice clean mesh. So what I want to go ahead and do is just go ahead and use group loops. And then just smooth it out a little bit. Inflate it here to give it a bit more girth. There we are. And then go ahead and use the clip tools. And just go around the edge here. Alright, so you see we have a little bit of a kind of lumpy area at the top, so I can use the H polish brush to push that back and to make it more even. And I felt that it was protruding too much. I went ahead and used transpose and moved it in towards the other mesh a little bit. Alright, so now I'm going to try to make a kind of a little detail right here. So I went ahead and masked off the bottom. And what I went ahead and did is separated this as a different polygroup and then used group loops with 0 edge smoothness. And you can see that's why we have that very jagged edge. Alright, so what I want to do with this mesh is I want to go ahead and transpose it into a different mesh. And I don't mean transpose in the way that it's used in ZBrush, but I want to go ahead and project the detail on this mesh onto a new mesh. There's a lot of polygons in areas I don't want, so I'm going to go ahead and click Remesh All, and you'll see I get this kind of new mesh that has very even polygon distribution. And now I'm just going to hide everything except for those two, the new mesh and the one I want to project from. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Project All to project all this detail. And I'm going to go ahead and just go up a few subdivisions and continue to project. And now what I want to do is I want to separate this bottom area out as a polygroup, so I can go ahead and add detail there. So I'm going to go ahead and separate the polygroup by masking. And then I can go ahead and use group loops to kind of add a few groups in there. And you notice it smoothed things out a little bit there. So what we can do is use the projection brushes or project all to go ahead and push that back into where it was, to the correct shape of the mesh. So there we go. You see now we have the mesh in place where it's supposed to be, and we also have the polygroups that we can now use to add a little bit of detail. But I want to go ahead and use the clip brushes to clean this up a bit. There we are. Alright, so just adding a few edges here to make it so that this particular mesh integrates well with the mesh adjacent to it. Alright, so you can see with this polygroups, what I'm going to go ahead and do is hide the inner polygroup, and then I'm going to use auto groups, and so we still have this one group in here. And so what we can go ahead and do is play around with the inflation tools and see what really looks good as a detail, or a surface change really. That looks a little bit fishy, so I'm going to delete that. Alright, I'm going to get in here and start smoothing out this area just to kind of clean it up a bit. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and mask this area off right here, just so I can go ahead and convert it into a new polygroup. And we're going to use this new polygroup to create more detail. So go ahead and make polygroups from masking. And then we can use group loops again. Here we go. And again, you can see how it's smoothed out everything. So I'm going to go ahead and average out these polygons a little bit in the new group I made, just so that they're a little bit more evenly distributed. And then I'm going to go ahead and reproject again. In the end, I don't really keep this detail, but I think it's really important to note the kind of complex method or direction we had to take to actually get it. It took a lot of projection and a lot of moving around and making polygroups. So it's important to keep note of the kind of complex ways you can use their various tools to make something work. And here I just used a mech stamp that I'd previously created to kind of add in a little bit of detail, just to feel it out and see how it looks. But I'm not going to get too much into the details here. I really want to focus on the overall shape of things. Okay, so here I'm going to go ahead and start working on the back. And what I'm doing is I'm using the H-polish brush again and the smooth brush again to kind of clean everything up and make the overall shape what it was, or kind of an average of the concept mesh. Alright, so I can go ahead and mask off the area that I want. Get kind of this whole thing in here. And then just extract again. And you notice I use negative extraction just so I don't have to move the mesh around again. And you can see the kind of mess of polygroups that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and use auto groups to unify those larger areas. And now I'm just playing around with the polygroups. Using different polygroup settings, using different group loop settings will give you completely different results. So it's important to kind of mess around with those and to see exactly how they will affect your mesh. And then I went ahead and cut that from the side just to make it line up correctly with the first mesh that we made. Alright, so I'm using the H polish brush to kind of clean this area out a little bit. And then trying to get that same angular look that I have on the front of the torso. Alright, so now that I have that area, I kind of want to match it with my template mesh, the mesh I'm using to create all of these subtools. So I'm kind of pulling it out a little bit and just making sure it lines up okay. Because the next thing I want to make is this little flap that will need to align pretty well with the mesh that we have just created. Alright, so using a little bit of the move tool, I can kind of get that to a fairly good average. And then I can just go ahead and mask it out. And you notice I'm masking a bit more than I will actually need for the final mesh or subtool of the one I'm creating now. But the reason I'm doing that is to make sure that I have enough extra area that I can clip off and still have the full mesh. So there's no kind of gap in between the meshes. So go ahead and use my group loops. I'll smooth things out a bit. And then go ahead and use my clipping brushes to kind of draw around that area and to make it exactly aligned with what's previously there. Alright, so there we go. And then I went ahead and used the group function of the clipping brushes there so I could use the group loops to kind of smooth things out a bit there. And you notice when I use the polish brush, I got these kind of little bevels at the edge of the mesh where the mesh kind of has corners. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna use the H polish brush to clean those up. And that's a fairly fast process. Alright, so there we go. And since I deleted the other side in the process of the clipping, I'm just gonna go ahead and mirror it back over. Alright, so now on to the next piece. This one is a fairly complex piece, and you can see from the mess that the extraction gave us, it's going to be a bit of work to finesse this into the shape we want. So I went ahead and used group loops and kind of smoothed it out a bit. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the projection brush and turn on Z add and just kind of push it into my concept mesh because I have the concept mesh fairly accurate about the way that I want it. So I can go ahead and just push this in and use that and modify that to make the perfect mesh. And I went ahead and dropped the concept torso down to the canvas again by pressing Shift S in the top left-hand corner. I can kind of just look at what I'm trying to create. I can have some kind of reference. So now I'm going to go ahead and use the H polish brush to clean this area up, or clean the whole mesh up rather. And use the clipping brushes. And the clipping brushes are really going to do a lot of work on this. I don't need to worry too much about the circular area because clip circle center will deal with that quite well. Alright, here we go. And just invert that and it'll cut it straight out. Alright, so I've unhidden the concept mesh so I can kind of see exactly the areas I need to cut. And you can see fairly quickly, without too much strain, we got the mesh that we want. So we can go ahead and use the subtool master to mirror that mesh. Alright, so now I'm going to start cleaning out the concept mesh up here in the top of the back, so I can go ahead and use it for some more mesh extractions. And particularly right now I'm focusing on the area that encompasses the arm. So the areas that will allow the hole for the arm to come out. So I just kind of have an average of what I want, and I'll go ahead and extract it. And clean up my polygroups again. And use group loops. And you can see there's not really much to be done with this mesh, just a few clippings and we should be good. We can go ahead and clip around the arm area. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and move on to a few other areas of the back. I'm going to start with a little small piece right here. So I'll go ahead and extract it. And just kind of smooth that back. And after I've gone ahead and used group loops on it, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it for now. That's going to be more of a placeholder. And I want to get this larger area. It's more important to work on the larger areas when you're kind of trying to block things in, because it helps more to allow you to understand exactly what's going on. That's good. I can go ahead and use group loops and just pull things around here to kind of fit them into place. And we can start using the H polish brush to clean things up. Alright, so now that I have everything kind of in place, I'm just going to use the clipping brushes to cut away at this. And I'll use clip circle center to get a perfect circle right there. And since I kind of want to have a little kind of exhaust thing going on right there, I just wanted to put in a cylinder to act as a placeholder. Because that'll be a minor detail, and we don't need to worry about it now. So I just kind of want to throw something there that will allow me to read the overall form of it. And that cylinder will actually help me later on to create some of the inner parts of this area. Alright, so I went ahead and clipped that away, and you can see I had a little bit of a mess over there on the other side, probably from inaccurate masking, so I just went and used Smart Resim to clean that up. Alright, so I'm just extracting this small piece here, and you can see it's got a lot of folding on itself. For a lot of these areas it doesn't really matter because we're not using any of the complex edge loop techniques that we went over in the basic video. So it's not really important to get a clean extraction as long as it's workable, and pretty much everything is in ZBrush as long as you can relax the polygons. Right, so I'm just going to use the clipping brushes to kind of cut away at this. And then move this out into place because it was kind of falling away from the mesh from the other side. Alright, so that looks pretty good. I just wanted to go ahead and see what it looks like if it was stretched down a little bit. And it looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this little piece in as well, because eventually I want to work on the inside, and so I need all the surrounding meshes to show me exactly where I need that. So I want to go ahead and even out this mesh. And I actually made it quite big, but that's so I can use the clipping brushes to clip it back down eventually. So we can go ahead and move it into place, about where it should be. And we can use the H polish brush to create a very flat surface. Alright, so you see I made a new layer, and the reason I did that was I didn't know whether or not I wanted that clip. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is press visible, and what that's going to do is take all the visible subtools and bring it into 3ds Max using the Go Z utility. And in 3ds Max, what I'm going to do is just create a very basic mesh. It's very simple. Actually all packages will be able to handle this kind of mesh creation. So I'm just creating vertices here, and I'm going to go ahead and draw polygons in between them. And the reason I'm using 3ds Max is because this mesh would have been kind of a hard thing to struggle with, considering it was kind of a hollow cylinder, and I didn't want to struggle with it in ZBrush. So what I went ahead and did is just created a very basic mesh. You can kind of see it here. And now I'm just going to use a shell modifier in 3ds Max. I'm not sure what it's called in other packages, but I'm positive that all of them have a similar function. And I'm adding a bit of edges in here to make sure that when they get subdivided, they subdivide with hard edges. Alright, so now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and go back into Go Z and bring it back into ZBrush. And so here's our mesh fully integrated. There we go, and you can see how it kind of fills out everything and makes it not look so hollow anymore. So now I'm going to work on this top area of the torso, of the upper back. And I just kind of want to smooth this out like we've done previously. And you notice I'm using the clay tubes brush to kind of push in the areas that I've already created. And that's just so I can kind of see what's actually going on. And so I use the Damien standard brush there just to make a huge cut into the mesh right there, just to create an overall like surface change. And so there we go. I'm just going to go ahead and mask this area out and make the final bridge between the upper torso area that'll fit the arm in. So I went ahead and extracted negatively, just because it's easier to hide this stuff, to hide this new mesh in between the other meshes rather than bring it on top and have to edit the other meshes surrounding the mesh I'm currently working on in order to make it integrate well. Okay, and now we can use the subtool master to mirror that over. Alright, so now I'm trying to get the upper area of the back kind of blocked in here. I'm trying to decide on the overall shape, so I'm going to go ahead and push this down just to see how it looks. Alright, here we are. So I like the center area. It seems approximately right, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of carve into that just a little bit more, and then use the masking brush to extract it. Here, just try to clean up the mesh a little bit, or the mask a little bit. Alright, and so using an extraction of -1, I went ahead and extracted that. And now we can just use the previous techniques of the clipping brushes to clean this up. Alright, so now we're kind of getting into the upper plating, the kind of hovering plating. That's going to be a theme with this character. So what I'm going to go ahead and do after I smooth this out a bit is mask this off. There we go. And then extract it. And then kind of play around with the clipping to see exactly what looks good. And if you find that you're clipping the wrong way, and you don't feel like changing it around, all you have to do is add a direction change, a vertex in the clipping curve. So just, you can press Alt once or twice, and it'll allow you to invert the clip by holding Alt, and then letting go of the clip. Okay, so since this area is kind of hovering over the back, I need an area that will kind of look like it integrates well into. So I kind of raised this area a bit, and what I'm going to do after I mask it off and extract it is it's going to be a placeholder for it's going to be kind of like an insert of a box, and there's going to be a lot of mechanical detail in there. Pretty well hidden, but it'll help a lot to kind of enhance the overall feel that this is an actual mechanical guy and not just a surface model with stamps on it. Okay, so it produced a really clean mesh, so I'm just going to go ahead and use group loops. Clean this up a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and hide the other side so I can go ahead and use the clipping brushes without fear of destroying the other side of the mesh. And I'm going to kind of cut this into position about where it would look like it should be integrated. So right about there. And what I'm doing is I'm pretty much following the floating geometry that you see above it. I kind of want to follow that around. Since it's going to be integrated into that, it kind of has to look like they're part of the same area, or that they kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. So there we go. And go ahead and delete my lower resolution geometry and then use the group loops to kind of clean that up. I'm going to go ahead and turn the polish up a little bit because you can see some of the clipping areas were giving me errors, and so that will fix that very easily. Okay, and so we have the basic torso made, and in the next video we're going to go ahead and start detailing the torso.